If the last chapter ended with a country quietly locking inequality into its foundation, this one is the moment a critical mass of Americans decides to kick the foundation in. Liberalism, the belief that an active federal government should expand freedom, opportunity, and equality, reaches its absolute high water mark in these 13 years. And then, in almost the exact same window, it starts coming apart, attacked from the left for moving too slowly, and from the right for moving at all. This is also the chapter where nearly every major fault line in modern American politics gets its current shape. Voting rights, abortion, war powers, policing, gay rights, indigenous rights, immigration and language, gun politics, the role of the courts. You're about to watch every single one of these get its modern starting gun fired sometime between 1960 and 1973. We're covering 6 things today. 1. John Kennedy's cautious liberalism at home and his much more aggressive Cold War brinkmanship abroad. 2. The civil rights movement's high tide, from the Freedom Rides through the Voting Rights Act, and the price the movement paid to get there. 3. The turn toward black power and the urban uprisings that liberal legislation alone couldn't prevent. 4. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and the Warren Court's quiet revolution in what rights actually mean in practice. 5. The Vietnam War and the New Left campus revolt it provoked. And 6. The wave of liberation movements, women, Chicano and Mexican American activists, Native Americans, gay Americans, that all crested at once, and the conservative backlash rising to meet every one of them. Let's get into it. One framing note before we start. Liberalism in this era wasn't handed down from Washington out of pure goodwill. Almost every major law in this chapter, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, exists because organized pressure from outside government, marchers, boycotters, lawyers, dying soldiers' mothers, made inaction more costly than action. Keep that pattern in mind because it recurs constantly. The government in this chapter mostly reacts. The people pushing it are the ones actually driving. John Kennedy takes office in 1961 as the youngest elected president in American history. 43 years old, photogenic, married to a genuine style icon, promising a new frontier to battle tyranny, poverty, disease, and war. The reality is more modest. Without strong congressional majorities, Kennedy mostly nudges the New Deal's existing framework forward. A higher minimum wage, expanded unemployment benefits, more public housing money, real but incremental, disappointing plenty of liberals who expected bolder action. Where Kennedy shows real appetite is fighting communism abroad, and it goes badly almost immediately. In April 1961, he approves a CIA plan, inherited from Eisenhower, to land Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs and topple Fidel Castro. Kennedy refuses to provide air cover to avoid revealing American involvement, and Castro's forces crush the invasion in 3 days. A humiliating failure that, if anything, makes Castro more popular at home and pushes him further into the Soviet orbit. That embarrassment sets up the single closest the Cold War ever comes to going nuclear. In October 1962, American spy planes discover the Soviets secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world genuinely doesn't know if it's about to end. Kennedy rejects his general's push for an immediate airstrike, opts instead for a naval blockade, and after tense back-channel negotiation, Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles in exchange for a quiet American pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret promise to remove American missiles from Turkey. Both leaders walk away having learned the same lesson. Direct communication during a crisis is not optional, it's existential. The Moscow-Washington hotline gets installed the following year, specifically because both sides realized how close miscommunication alone had come to ending civilization. That 13-day standoff isn't just a Cold War trivia footnote, it's the actual template for how nuclear powers still try to manage confrontation without escalation. Back-channel talks, face-saving off-ramps for both sides, private guarantees that never make the public statement. You can watch the same basic choreography today anytime nuclear rhetoric spikes around Russia's war in Ukraine or North Korea's missile tests. Public toughness paired with private, deliberately quiet negotiation. Because everyone involved still remembers, or has studied, exactly how close October 1962 actually came to going the other way. Underneath the missile crisis and Bay of Pigs headlines, Kennedy's Vietnam policy also quietly hardens during these same years. Advisors and equipment flowing in under the same domino theory logic that shaped his Cuba decisions. a commitment his successor would inherit and dramatically expand, which we'll get to shortly. Kennedy never gets to finish defining his own legacy. On November 22, 1963, he's assassinated in Dallas, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson, a Texan with none of Kennedy's polish but decades more legislative skill, suddenly inherits both the unfinished new frontier and a civil rights movement that had already been building unstoppable momentum for years, with or without the White House's help. The movement, built patiently through the 1950s, hits full stride in the early 60s, and it does it through relentless, deliberate confrontation with segregation's actual machinery. In 1961, freedom riders, black and white activists riding together on interstate buses through the Deep South, get firebombed and beaten in Alabama, forcing the federal government to finally enforce existing court rulings that had banned segregated interstate travel. In August 1963, roughly 250,000 people gather for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King delivers "I Have a Dream." But the march's other headline speaker, SNCC Chairman John Lewis, delivers a far angrier speech, warning that Black Americans will not wait much longer for the government to act. It's also worth naming who did the unglamorous work that made all of this function. Bayard Rustin, a gay black pacifist who'd studied Gandhi's nonviolent tactics firsthand, organized the entire logistics of the March on Washington. Buses, sound systems, security, sanitation, for 250,000 people, and did it while staying deliberately out of the spotlight because his sexuality made him a liability certain movement leaders worried segregationists would exploit. The march succeeded because of that kind of invisible, meticulous organizing labor, not despite it. Congress finally responds in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, banning discrimination in employment and public accommodations nationwide, the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. But passing a law and enforcing it in Mississippi are two very different problems, which is exactly what Freedom Summer sets out to test in 1964. Hundreds of mostly white Northern college students head south to register black voters and staff freedom schools, a deliberate strategy to draw national media attention to a state that had, until then, mostly ignored outside pressure. It works at a brutal cost. 3 volunteers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, are murdered by the Klan working with local police before the summer even really begins. Out of that same organizing effort comes the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an integrated alternative to Mississippi's all-white official Democratic delegation. At the 1964 Democratic Convention, sharecropper and organizer Fannie Lou Hamer delivers televised testimony so raw and devastating about the violence she'd survived for trying to vote that Johnson reportedly tried to cut her broadcast off with an impromptu press conference. Johnson offers the MFDP a token compromise, 2 at-large seats instead of actual recognition, and the MFDP rejects it outright, a moment that permanently fractures the movement's trust in liberal Democratic allies who'd say the right things but stop short of real power sharing. In March 1965, state troopers attack peaceful voting rights marchers crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what becomes known as Bloody Sunday, and the televised brutality shocks Johnson into action. He goes before Congress, tells the country the black cause must be our cause too, and 5 months later signs the Voting Rights Act, banning literacy tests and empowering federal officials to register voters directly in states with histories of discrimination. It works immediately and dramatically. By 1968, a majority of eligible black voters in the South are registered, up from a small fraction just years earlier. None of this protection turned out to be permanent, which is worth knowing before we move on. In 2013, the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder decision struck down the section of the Voting Rights Act that had required states with discriminatory histories to get federal approval before changing voting laws, on the reasoning that conditions had improved enough that the formula was outdated. Within hours of the ruling, several of those exact states began passing new voting restrictions, closing polling places disproportionately in black neighborhoods. Fannie Lou Hamer's fight over who gets counted and whose vote actually reaches the tally isn't a closed 1965 story. It's an active legal and political fight that reopened in the last decade and hasn't fully resolved since. Legal victories didn't touch the deeper economic reality for millions of black Americans, especially outside the South, and that gap produces a genuine split in the movement's strategy. Malcolm X, a former convict turned minister in the Nation of Islam, rejects King's integration and nonviolence approach entirely, arguing Black Americans needed self-defense and self-determination, not requests for white America's approval. He's assassinated in 1965, but his ideas outlive him. In 1966, SNCC elects Stokely Carmichael chairman, who publicly declares Black Power the movement's new central goal. The following year, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale found the Black Panther Party in Oakland, combining armed community self-defense patrols with genuinely popular neighborhood programs. Free breakfast for school children, community health clinics that did more concrete daily good for poor Black families than most federal programs managed. Meanwhile, cities that had never faced Southern-style Jim Crow signs were burning anyway. Starting in 1964 and accelerating for the next several years, uprisings break out in Harlem, Los Angeles' Watts neighborhood, Newark, Detroit, driven by police brutality, housing discrimination, and unemployment that no civil rights law on paper had actually fixed. Most white Americans see straightforward criminality. King, still committed to nonviolence, reads it differently. A riot, he says in 1967, is the language of the unheard. Johnson's own Kerner Commission reaches an unusually blunt conclusion. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, and names white racism, not black criminality, as the actual root cause. That line from the Kerner Commission is quoted constantly today, 60 years later, in nearly every serious modern conversation about racial wealth gaps, school segregation, and the aftermath of events like the 2020 protests following George Floyd's murder, because the underlying diagnosis, that inequality is structural rather than a story of individual failure, is still the exact fault line separating how different Americans explain the same statistics. The federal government's response to the movement's more radical wing was also less generous than its response to King. The FBI's COINTELPRO program specifically targeted the Black Panthers with infiltration and disinformation, and in 1969, Chicago police, tipped off by an FBI informant, raided an apartment and killed Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in their beds, a level of state violence against domestic political organizations that never touched the mainstream civil rights leadership the same way. Johnson takes the sympathy and mandate from Kennedy's assassination and does something genuinely rare in American politics. He actually spends it. Winning a landslide election in his own right in 1964 against conservative Barry Goldwater, Johnson launches the Great Society, the most ambitious expansion of federal government since the New Deal. Medicare provides health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid covers the poor, Head Start gives low-income kids early education, and a new community action program funnels federal money directly to poor neighborhoods to shape their own anti-poverty programs. It's not redistribution of wealth so much as an attempt to use economic growth itself as the engine, cut taxes to grow the economy, then use some of that growth to fund the safety net. It actually works, at least by the numbers. The poverty rate drops from 20% to 13% in 5 years, and black poverty specifically falls from 40% to 20% over the same stretch. Johnson's tax cuts, combined with Great Society spending, helped push the gross national product from $591 billion in 1963 to $977 billion by decade's end. Proof, liberals argued at the time, that you could grow the economy and expand the safety net simultaneously rather than treating them as a trade-off. At the exact same time, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren is quietly rewriting what constitutional rights actually mean day to day for ordinary Americans, not through legislation, but through case law. Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963 establishes that anyone accused of a felony has a right to a lawyer even if they can't afford one. Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 requires police to actually inform suspects of their rights before questioning. The source of the exact words, "You have the right to remain silent," that still get read in every American arrest today. Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965 strikes down a law banning contraceptives, establishing for the first time a constitutional right to privacy that doesn't appear anywhere explicitly in the text of the Constitution itself, reasoned instead from the penumbras of other rights already listed. That privacy reasoning becomes the direct legal foundation 8 years later for Roe versus Wade. The Warrant Court also bans official school prayer in 1962, ruling it violates the separation of church and state, a decision that ignites exactly the kind of religious backlash you'd expect from a country that had just spent the 1950s fusing Christianity and patriotism into a single civic identity. Griswold's privacy reasoning is worth sitting with a little longer, because it isn't a settled historical footnote either. In 2022, the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade, and in a separate concurring opinion, one justice explicitly suggested the court should reconsider Griswold itself, along with the right to same-sex marriage. Whether or not that reasoning eventually gets applied beyond abortion, the fact that a sitting justice raised it at all means the entire unenumerated rights framework this court built in the 1960s is genuinely back on the table as a live legal question, not a closed one. While Johnson builds the Great Society at home, he's simultaneously walking the country deeper into a war he privately doubted from the start. In August 1964, after a murky, disputed naval encounter in the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson asked Congress for authority to respond, and Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president essentially unlimited power to wage war in Vietnam without ever formally declaring one. American troop levels explode from 16,000 to over 500,000 by 1968. It's a guerrilla war against an enemy embedded in the civilian population, and American soldiers, unable to distinguish combatant from farmer, increasingly turn to indiscriminate violence. In March 1968, an American platoon murders between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, in the village of My Lai, a massacre the military actively covers up for over a year before it becomes public. The turning point is the Tet Offensive in January 1968, when North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launch a coordinated surprise assault on cities across South Vietnam. American forces ultimately repel it militarily, but the psychological damage at home is total. If the enemy could pull off an operation this coordinated after years of American assurances that victory was close, the assurances themselves were clearly false. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, goes on air and calls the war a stalemate, and Johnson, watching, reportedly says if he'd lost Cronkite, he'd lost Middle America. Weeks later, Johnson announces he won't seek re-election. That betrayal of trust radicalizes a generation of students who'd grown up believing their government's word. Tom Hayden and the Students for a Democratic Society draft the Port Huron Statement in 1962, explicitly borrowing Eisenhower's own phrase, military-industrial complex, to condemn Cold War foreign policy and demand participatory democracy. Campus protest explodes nationwide, from Berkeley's free speech movement in 1964 to draft card burnings to occupations of university buildings. Though it's worth noting only about 1 in 5 college students actually attended a demonstration at the movement's peak. The legal architecture built to fight this war never really got dismantled either. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gets formally repealed in 1971, but the basic template, Congress handing the executive branch open-ended authority to wage war based on a single triggering event, reappears almost exactly after September 11, 2001, when Congress passed an authorization for use of military force that presidents from both parties have since stretched to justify military action in more than a dozen countries, entirely without a new vote, for over 2 decades running. Vietnam is the reason endless war and mission creep became permanent fixtures of American political vocabulary. Watching the civil rights movement's playbook work, group after group organizes its own version of it. Betty Friedan's Problem with No Name becomes an actual organization in 1966, the National Organization for Now. More radical feminists go further, organizing consciousness-raising groups and publicly protesting the Miss America pageant in 1968. In 1973, Roe v. Wade establishes a constitutional right to abortion in the first trimester, built directly on Griswold's privacy reasoning. A genuine legal landmark that also instantly becomes one of the most contested rulings in American history. Roe's 50-year run ended, of course. In June 2022, the Supreme Court's Dobbs v. Jackson decision overturned it outright, ruling abortion regulation should return entirely to individual states, and within months, roughly half the states enacted new bans or severe restrictions. The reproductive rights fight this chapter treats as a 1973 landmark victory is, as of the last few years, once again a fully open, state-by-state political battle, the exact opposite of how this chapter's textbook version of history usually gets taught. Mexican-American and Chicano activists build a parallel movement. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta organized the National Farm Workers Association in 1962, and their 5-year great boycott and strike against California growers wins real material gains through coalition building and consumer pressure. Reyes Tijerina takes a more radical approach in New Mexico, organizing La Alianza to reclaim land Mexican-American families had lost. Younger activists form Mecha and stage school walkouts across the Southwest, protesting underfunded, discriminatory education. Native American activists organized the American Indian Movement in 1968, and in 1969, a coalition calling itself Indians of All Tribes occupies the abandoned federal prison on Alcatraz Island for 19 months. AIM later occupies the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre in 1973, a 71-day armed standoff that forces renewed national attention onto reservation poverty. The vocabulary and tactics from this era, land acknowledgement, treaty rights litigation, direct action occupation, run in an unbroken line straight through to the modern land back movement and the Standing Rock pipeline protests. And in June 1969, patrons at the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York's Greenwich Village routinely raided by police, fight back for the first time instead of quietly dispersing. 3 nights of resistance that becomes the symbolic birth of the modern gay liberation movement, and eventually, the annual Pride marches held every June specifically to commemorate it. All of this change, arriving all at once, produces an equally organized backlash. Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, though it loses in a landslide, builds the actual intellectual and organizational infrastructure that Ronald Reagan inherits and rides to the presidency 16 years later. Alabama Governor George Wallace runs an openly segregationist populist campaign that performs shockingly well even outside the South, tapping into a very specific grievance. Working-class white voters who felt liberal elites had rewarded rioters and privileged college protesters while ignoring their own economic anxieties. A grievance-based populism running through American politics in barely altered form for the next 60 years. Pull it all together. Liberalism's high tide and its unraveling happen in the exact same 13 years. Not as 2 separate stories, but as one continuous chain reaction. Civil rights victories inspire liberation movements across race, gender, sexuality, and indigenous identity, all of which provoke an organized conservative backlash, all while an increasingly unpopular war drains the money, trust, and moral authority liberalism needed to keep expanding. By 1969, Richard Nixon sits in the White House, and the arc this chapter traces from Kennedy's cautious optimism to Nixon's election is really the arc of a governing philosophy spending its entire store of political capital in one incredibly compressed burst. The through line worth carrying past this chapter is the one from the introduction. Almost nothing in here happened because Washington decided, on its own, that the moment had come. It happened because people outside government, marchers, boycotters, occupiers, litigators, made the cost of inaction higher than the cost of change. That's true of the Civil Rights Act, true of the Voting Rights Act, true of Roe, true of Title IX and the EPA and Medicare. And it's worth noticing that nearly every one of those victories has, in the 60 years since, faced a serious modern rollback attempt. Shelby County gutting the Voting Rights Act, Dobbs overturning Roe, a sitting justice questioning Griswold itself. Liberalism's 1960s victories were never actually permanent settlements. They were positions that had to be held, and in several major cases, that holding has already failed. So here's the honest note to end on, not a tidy one. This chapter isn't the story of rights won. It's the story of rights fought for, sometimes won, and in several cases already lost again within living memory. What you do with that pattern, whether you find it discouraging or clarifying, is genuinely up to you. But pretending the 1960s settled any of these questions permanently just isn't what the historical record actually shows. Get your Chapter 26 source response done in Canvas, and next time, we watch what a country exhausted by all of this turns to next. See you in Chapter 27.